Welcome to ZoomInData. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining the 25th video in our extended Azure Logic Apps series. In this session, titled Certification Prep, AZ400, AZ305 and Logic Apps Interview Questions, we will cover the most frequently asked Logic Apps questions in Microsoft certifications, AZ400 DevOps, AZ305 Solutions Architect, 25 high-impact, scenario-based interview questions with detailed, point-wise model answers. Tips for answering confidently, structuring your responses, and showing deep understanding. Common traps and how to stand out in real interviews, 2026 edition. Whether you're preparing for certification, job interviews, or just want to master the platform, this is the episode you've been waiting for. If you find this content valuable, please subscribe to ZoomInData and enable notifications. Let us begin. Question. Explain the difference between consumption and standard Logic Apps models and when you would choose each in a production scenario. Consumption. Multi-tenant, serverless, pay-per execution, triggers plus actions plus connectors. No fixed cost when idle. Standard. Single tenant, dedicated compute, vCPU, memory, fixed monthly capacity cost plus connector usage. Unlimited built-in operations. Choose consumption for variable, low-volume workloads, quick prototyping, or when minimizing fixed costs is priority. Choose standard for predictable high throughput, VNet, private endpoints, local VS Code development, or strict performance, SLA requirements. How do you implement idempotency in a Logic Apps workflow to safely handle duplicate events? Generate or receive unique correlation, message, order ID early in workflow. Before any side effect action, create record, send email, charge payment. Check if ID already exists in persistent store, Dataverse, Cosmos DB, SQL. If exists and status equals processed, terminate with already processed. If not, process. Update status to processed on success. Describe how you would secure a Logic Apps HTTP request trigger endpoint exposed to external partners. Use SAS, shared access signature, key with expiration and IP restrictions in URL. Add OAuth 2.0 or API key validation in workflow. Condition plus HTTP call to validate token. Restrict access with private endpoints, standard model, or Azure front door plus WAF. Validate payload schema and signature, example, HMAC, to prevent tampering. How would you migrate a BizTalk orchestration with X12ED processing to Logic Apps? Inventory artifacts, orchestrations right-pointing arrow workflows, maps right-pointing arrow liquid, XSLT in integration account, schemas right-pointing arrow integration account, partners, agreements right-pointing arrow integration account. Use decode X12 plus transform XML plus encode X12 actions. Replace custom pipelines with Azure functions or inline code. Parallel test with shadow routing right-pointing arrow cutover with partner coordination. Explain how to build an event-driven order processing pipeline using Event Grid and Logic Apps. Publish order created event to Event Grid custom topic from e-commerce platform. Logic Apps trigger when an event is published to custom topic. Filter on event type equals order created. Actions. Validate order CHEC inventory. Process payment. Publish order processed event. Multiple subscribers. Inventory. Billing. Shipping. React independently. How do you use managed identities in Logic Apps to securely access Azure resources? Enable system assigned or user assigned managed identity on Logic App resource. Grant identity required RBAC roles on target. Example. Key Vault Secrets user, storage blob data contributor. In connectors or HTTP actions, select Managed Identity, Authentication Type, No credentials stored. What is the role of the on-premises data gateway in Logic Apps hybrid scenarios? Provides secure outbound-only connectivity from Azure to on-premises systems, SQL, SAP, file shares. No inbound ports needed on firewall. All communication initiated from gateway machine. Supports high availability, clustering, and monitoring via Azure portal. How would you implement retry logic and circuit breaker patterns in a Logic Apps workflow? Retry, configure action retry policy, fixed, exponential backoff, for transient errors only. Circuit breaker, track failure count in Cosmos DB, Redis. Condition action skips calls if threshold reached. Cooldown period, half open test, dead letter, move failed messages to service bus dead letter queue for manual review. Explain how to call Azure functions from Logic Apps and when you should do it. Use Azure Functions Connector or HTTP action. Pass payload, pass response. Call functions for complex custom code, external libraries, long-running tasks, CPU-intensive work. Logic Apps handles orchestration, connectors. Functions handles compute-heavy logic. How do you optimize a high-throughput Logic Apps workflow for performance and cost? Use webhook triggers instead of polling. Enable concurrency in for each loops, limit 10 to 50. Batch connector calls instead of per item. Prefer standard model for unlimited built-in actions and predictable performance. Shorten run history retention. What are the key differences between Logic Apps and Power Automate? Logic Apps, Azure PaaS, developer-focused, consumption, standard hosting, full VNet, private endpoints, deep CI, CD. Power Automate, Microsoft 365, Power Platform, citizen developer focus, multi-tenant only, premium licensing for advanced connectors. Use Power Automate for M365-centric flows, Logic Apps for enterprise integration, hybrid, high scale. How do you expose a Logic Apps workflow as a secure API using Azure API Management? Create HTTP request trigger right pointing arrow get URL. Import into APIM as backend right pointing arrow add policies, rate limit, JWT validation, transformation. Use managed identity or SAS key for secure backend call. Publish API for partners with subscription keys. Describe how to implement a Saga pattern with compensation in Logic Apps. Use stateful standard workflow or Cosmos DB state tracking. Each step in scope right pointing arrow on failure right pointing arrow parallel compensating branch. Run after equals failed. Example: book hotel right pointing arrow charge card right pointing arrow book flight. If flight fails right pointing arrow cancel hotel plus refund card. How do you handle large file processing in Logic Apps? Avoid loading entire file into memory. Use chunking actions, new in 2026. Store file in blob. Pass reference, URL to downstream actions or functions. Process in batches or stream where API supports. What monitoring and alerting strategy would you implement for production Logic Apps? Enable diagnostics. Log analytics workspace. Alerts. Failed runs greater than 5 in 5 minutes. Average duration greater than SLA. Throttling events. Dashboards. Success rate. Latency P99. Connector usage. Integrate with Microsoft Teams, Slack via action groups. How do you use Azure OpenAI in a Logic Apps workflow for intelligent processing? Add Azure OpenAI connector right pointing arrow chat completion action. Pass dynamic prompt from previous steps. Example: customer note, document text. Pass response, condition or branch based on result, sentiment, category, fraud score. What is the Model Context Protocol, MCP, and how does Logic Apps support it? MCP standardizes how AI agents discover and call tools, services. Logic Apps workflows, connectors can be published as MCP servers, 2026 feature. Agents in Azure AI Studio consume them via Azure API Center governance. How do you reduce Logic Apps costs in a high-volume production environment? Switch polling, webhook, event grid triggers. Shorten run history retention, 7 to 30 days. Use built-in actions instead of managed connectors. Enable concurrency, batching in loops. Choose standard model when executions exceed approximately 1 to 3 million per month. How do you implement CI/CD for standard Logic Apps? Develop locally in VS Code with Azure Logic Apps extension. Commit project to Git, Azure repos, GitHub. Use GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps pipeline to deploy app. Parameterize connections, managed identity roles, environment variables. What are best practices for securing custom connectors? Define OAuth 2.0, client credentials preferred, or managed identity. Never store secrets in definition. Use connection level auth. Limit scopes to minimum required. Use private endpoints, VNet integration for backend calls. How do you handle exactly once processing when consuming from Service Bus or Event Grid? Event Grid, Service Bus deliver at least once right pointing arrow make workflow idempotent. Use unique message, event ID. Check Dataverse, Cosmos DB before processing. Store processed IDs with TTL to prevent duplicate side effects. Describe a scenario where you would use durable functions instead of stateful Logic Apps. Very long-running sagas, greater than 30 days, or complex state machines. Need entity functions for actor model state, example, per order state. Heavy external orchestration with timers, waiting for multiple events. Logic Apps usually sufficient. Use durable only when state logic is extremely complex. How do you debug a Logic Apps workflow that fails intermittently in production? Enable full diagnostics, log analytics, correlate failed runs with external events, API downtime, throttling. Add logging actions at key points. Use correlation ID to trace across services. Reproduce locally in VS Code, standard, with same payload. What is your recommended disaster recovery strategy for Logic Apps? Geo-redundant storage for run history and artifacts. Script backup, restore of integration accounts and custom connectors. Use cross-region deployment, standard, or Azure Front Door for failover. Test failover quarterly in non-prod. How would you design a multi-tenant order processing system where routing depends on tenant ID at runtime? Trigger, HTTP or event grid with tenant ID in payload. Lookup tenant config, Cosmos DB, Dataverse, using tenant ID. Dynamic switch or condition, route to tenant-specific backend, different APIs, databases. Use Azure API management for tenant isolation if exposing externally. Thank you for watching this detailed session on building resilient and idempotent workflows in Azure Logic Apps. If you found this video helpful, please like, share, and subscribe to ZoomInData. More advanced Azure Logic Apps content is coming soon. Stay connected and keep learning. See you in the next video.